So this is the session that's sort of at the heart of it, really. We've asked two remarkable speakers who've written on identity, pluralism, laïcité in France, in the United States, more broadly, to talk with us this morning a little bit about these questions of pluralism. Rabbi Delphine Orvier, as you know from the program, co-directs the liberal Jewish movement of France. She earned a degree and took the rabbinate 2008 at Hebrew University, lived in the United States, lived in Israel, and has been here in France leading one of two Parisian synagogues since 2008. She is affiliated through the liberal Jewish movement of France with the World Union of Progressive Judaism. She was previously editor-in-chief of Tenua, Review of Jewish Thought. She's published several books, Eve's Costume, a review of, on feminism, modesty, and Judaism, a book on sex and identity called How Rabbis Make Children, a book on living with our dead, and another one entitled There Is No Ajar. She recently collaborated also with a Muslim scholar, Rashid Benzine, co-authoring a book exploring the intersection of those two world religions. Yasha Monk, the founder of Persuasion, hosts the podcast The Good Fight. He's a journalist, best-selling author. This is his fifth book, which I really recommend. I'm almost done on identity and where these ideas came from at the university level that are now sort of mainstream. This book, Identity Trap, A Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time, is most recent, but he's also written The Great Experiment, People versus Democracy, and others. He's today a professor of practice international affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's a contributing editor at The Atlantic. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Public Scholar at City College. So we've asked these two thoughtful voices to speak a little bit about pluralism, identity, group affiliation, laïcité, and some of the tensions and differences between life and religious life in France versus American culture. In recent decades, Yasha talks about in this book, historically persecuted minority groups have in many ways gained new traction and respect, but as a result, their group identity has frequently become an obsession, undermining mutual appreciation, stifling discourse, leading to a kind of identity trap, he describes, that makes real progress harder. Do we anticipate that the wokeness, on the one hand, and MAGA-style national populism will reinforce one another, even unintentionally? What alternatives might be better to foster greater cultural and human dignity? So thank you for writing on these things. We thought maybe we'd start, because we're in France, with Rabbi Orvier, and then maybe sort of branch out and think about how some of these larger themes impact the world broadly.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for your presence, and thank you for the invitation. First, I'd like to maybe apologize to all of you. I wish I could have spent more time with you. I arrived 2 days ago, and I thought I would spend much more time with the group, and it wasn't made possible. And I thought I would start talking a bit about it. And actually, I even think I'm going to change a little bit what I thought telling you in this situation. I felt somehow that I needed, this morning I thought I needed to change a little bit what I had planned to tell you. For the past 24 hours, I had to deal with the things I never thought I would have to deal with threats against my Jewish community in Paris, with threats against my congregants, threats against my personal security, dealing with the police in Paris to protect my home. I had to deal with all those issues of congregants calling me because the police asked them to remove the mezuzah from their door and change the name of their bell. So this is the situation we are currently dealing with, which some might say may not come as a surprise. In a way, I think French Jewish community is kind of has been used in the past more than 20 years to deal with threats, but undoubtedly we're now in a different situation. And well, it's not only true in France, but it's particularly strong here today. I feel that for the past, as you said in your introduction, for the past years, I've been particularly involved in trying to promote dialogue with others, with a big O, different people building bridges, believing in bridges, and I'm trying as much as possible in the past weeks to strengthen what I've been doing. I'm even more than before trying to strengthen those conversations, meeting with my Arab colleagues, with the Muslim world in France. And I perceive clearly today the effect of fear and hate in our conversations, how difficult it is. I'm sorry if I'm going to say a lot of obvious things now, but the effect of fear and hate on how difficult it is to preserve our humanity in this situation, when actually witnessing inhumanity has a very big contagious effect on people. I'm perceiving it on myself, like I'm really struggling now to make sure I'm not demonizing anyone. You know, it's like it's a personal struggle, and also I'm fighting against things that I've been wrestling against all my life. Like, for example, the feeling that I'm back into a kind of ghettoization moment of Jewish history, that I feel that so many people around me are forced to be back into a ghetto, meaning feeling that they can have confidence in no one except themselves. And this is exactly the opposite of what I've been trying not only to do, but also to teach all my life. And I feel that there is around me a terrible awakening of ghosts, transgenerational ghosts. I wrote a lot about it in my last book about death and mourning processes that I didn't experience. It would be this, I didn't expect it to be this collective experience, and the people calling me and telling me that their children are now having nightmares about the Nazis and the Second World War. We are back into this ghost, awakening of ghosts and loneliness moment. And also having to deal with silence of people I expected would be much more vocal is very painful. I meet a lot of my friends, I call my pro-Palestinian friends, and I keep asking, and we had this conversation indeed, Jafar, 2 days ago, why it's so difficult to condemn sometimes. I feel sometimes very naive when I ask them this question, because frankly, I feel I've been so critical in recent years about so many things, about Israeli policy, and I have a hard time, from my naivete, to understand why it would be so difficult sometimes to condemn for people. I don't need them to condemn things to make me feel good. Sometimes I feel I need words so that their legitimate cause is not hijacked by hate and make it impossible to promote it in the future. Anyway, so I had planned, my plan was for this morning to talk with you about pluralism and identity, and those words that I often feel are have different meanings in America and in France. You know, it's interesting that pluralism and identity are charged positively on the other side of the ocean, whereas it very often seems to me that in France, when you use the word identity, it's kind of a dirty word, because for many people, it acts as a prelude to say disgusting things, in a way. So people are very concerned when people start talking about identity. I feel in France, it resonates in a way negatively. The other word that I want to talk about, nevertheless, for a minute, is the word of laïcité, that from my experience, no one in the Anglo-Saxon world is able to translate. It's like the quintessential lost in translation experience. I've been experiencing it when I used to live in New York years ago when I was studying in rabbinical school. People kept asking me to explain them what is the meaning of laïcité. And I always felt it was an absolute failure. There was this impossibility to explain how far it is and how different it is from American secularism. So I say a word about that. It's, obviously, laïcité is not a freedom of religion. It's not also a freedom from religion. It's something like a freedom from religious coercion and a belief that the emancipation, that individuals have to be emancipated from the weight of their birth and their belongings. So when I say it, I'm aware that it sounds like an absolute fiction. No one can be totally emancipated from his or own birth or belonging. But nevertheless, the French laïcité creates a very powerful narrative fiction. There is no society that lives without narrative fiction. And the French fiction is the belief that there is a possibility, if I could sum it up in one sentence, the French promise of laïcité promises that people will always be able to say I, first person singular, instead of we, first person plural. Because the French laïcité, or the French Republic, believes that the only we, supposedly, is the we, the we of the nation. And people should have the possibility to speak first person singular. And it creates a situation. I remember when I used to live in America that I was struck by how many times a day in public discourse and conversation, people start their sentence. I'm sorry if it's a bit a caricature what I'm saying now, but I was struck that so often people would start their sentence saying, as a Jew, I believe that. As an LGBT member, I think this. As a Muslim, I believe this or that. And I kept saying to myself, this is specifically a grammatical building of a sentence that no Frenchman would use. Like, I would never start a sentence saying, as a Jew, I believe this, because it would suggest that Jews as a group believe something, which makes no sense for me, in my French mindset. So it's interesting because last week I was interviewed by a New York Times journalist here in Europe, and we were talking about the rise of anti-Semitism, and she said, I don't understand why Elisabeth Borne, the French prime minister, who is the daughter of an Holocaust survivor, and Yael Braun-Privé, who is the president of the Assemblée Nationale, and she comes from a Jewish family, she said, I don't understand why when they fight anti-Semitism, they don't bring forth their family story. And I thought it was such an American thing to say, because actually, I think for a French mindset, it would totally weaken their point if they were to start their explanation of their fight through like this personal background of affiliation. It would be, I think, for their point of view, a kind of a threat of their appeared neutrality. And again, I'm aware it sounds very fictional what I'm saying now, because everybody knows who they are, where they come from, what their history is. But they shouldn't bring it forth because this is I would say, almost the French religious pact of laïcité, is that we're supposed to speak in the I mode that kind of disconnects you in your commitment from a we belonging of you to your tribe, to your birth, to your ethnicity. And it's not always easy to explain it to non-French audience, as you can imagine. So as you know, France is a very secular country, very, some would say, anti-religious, atheistic country. Nevertheless, in the past week, I have to witness and to admit that I see it in my synagogue. My synagogue is super crowded. Like, I've never seen so many people come to services. It's probably the most crowded synagogue in Paris, but we have every Shabbat now service between 300 and 500 people coming for Shabbat services. And it's interesting because French Jews didn't become abracadabra, hocus pocus believers. Jews have certain issues with faith, generally speaking. We spoke about a very famous Jewish joke that says that the Jewish Trinity definition is that there is a God. We didn't. He chose us and we don't believe in him, which is a good definition of Jewish faith. But I noticed that my synagogue is super crowded because I feel, and it has to do with the ghettoization process, that many people want to feel they belong, and they want to know who their allies are, because most of them feel they lost their allies, even people that they felt were very confident and sure allies. And all this testifies about what I would call the absolute loneliness, the territory of loneliness of French Jews. I think it should be added to tour guides. When you come to visit France, you can come to the Riviera and visit the Riviera, but today you should visit also the Jewish loneliness territory, which can be accounted for through many dates that I could easily summarize from my own autobiographical point of view. If I had to make a tour for you of the Jewish loneliness territory, I would probably start in the 1990s. I don't know if you remember, in 1990s, Carpentras in the south of France, not very far from here, a Jewish cemetery was desecrated. And it felt at the time, it was a major historical turning moment. Million people, French people in the street, François Mitterrand in the street, moment of national union against the new rise of anti-Semitism. And then, fast forward, beginning of year 2000, the Jewish community starts to talk about rise of anti-Semitism, coming mainly from the banlieue, from the suburbs of Paris. And at the time, the public power doesn't want to hear about the word anti-Semitism, clearly. Most of the time when the Jewish community raised this concern, we are told that it's a kind of Jewish paranoia, that there's an exaggeration of the threat, that actually it's more of an import of the Israeli-Arab conflict, that it's a tension between communities. It shouldn't be called anti-Semitism. It takes years to process, years of loneliness. 2006, Ilan Halimi is kidnapped, tortured, assassinated. I remember myself, 2006, I'm walking in the streets of Paris because there is a large, supposedly demonstration after the assassination of Ilan Halimi. At the time, I remember I'm super pregnant, I'm walking barely in the streets of Paris, and I look around me, and I notice that there are only Jews. Only Jews are walking in the streets of Paris. You probably remember this marker, also this moment. And the loneliness grows and grows and continues. 2012, Toulouse, Mera assassinates children and the teacher in a school. Absolute nightmare. I can't imagine, a worst scenario. Children killed in a school in France, 2012. Zero demonstration. No one in the streets. Condemnation, but no demonstration. And the loneliness grows. And 2015, here we are, Charlie Hebdo, wave of terror. 2 days later, the Hyper Cacher terror attack. And here we are, all millions back in the streets for demonstration. And for French Jews, there is this sentence in our head that can't be said, but is thought so loudly that we know that if it was only for the Hyper Cacher, there would be no one, because there was no one for Toulouse. As if, the death of Jews and children was not making it into the national consciousness. And it goes on, and then we can cite other dates, 2020, 2021, and 22, the COVID and the anti-vax demonstrations, and the Yellow Jackets demonstrations in the streets of France, pretty much everywhere. And here and there, pop-up slogans about the Jews. You don't know where it comes from. But the anti-vax and the Yellow Jackets demonstrators are constantly ringing the anti-Semitic mottos and slogans. Macron is the beach of the Jews, or the Zionist, or whatever. All those slogans are suddenly everywhere. And the anti-Semitism is ringing, and Jews feel lonely. And here we are, reaching finally our date, October 7th, in the past month. And now we attend, well, what I just described, and a new powerful phenomenon of absolute Nazification. I could use it that word. There's an absolute Nazification of the situation. Not only suddenly we hear, and this is what happened a few days ago in the Parisian subway, we hear young teenagers chanting in the Paris subway Nazi songs, Nazi chants, death to Jews, free Palestine, Heil Hitler. You know, nice. And then the Nazification amplifies, and you hear how it is used not to attack the Jews, but to describe them, which is the new now very powerful phenomenon, the idea that Jews are Nazis, Israelis are Nazis or worse than Nazis. This was said a few days ago by a famous French comedian, Guillaume Meurice. Marc just wrote an article about it. Meurice said in a national radio that he compared Netanyahu to a foreskin, like a foreskin-less, can you say, like a circumcised Nazi. That's what he said. So it's interesting that the Nazi lexicon is used again against Jews, but also describing them. So, and it always reminds me that the philosopher Yankelevich once said that it would be, of course, with a level of cynicism, but he said, it would be wonderful if Jews could be Nazis. You know, it would be wonderful because this way, what he meant is that it would be a very easy way to kosherize anti-Semitism. There's nothing more kosherizing, making it kosher, than to suddenly transform Jews into those who killed them. So then everything could be explained. So in the past weeks, I keep thinking about sentences I heard so often when I used to live in New York. For example, at the time, beginning of the year 2000, when I was in rabbinical school and the anti-Semitism was on the rise here in France, my American friends kept telling me, oh, it would never happen here. There's no way it could happen in America. And you know, it's interesting for me that today we reach so easily another era that in a way maybe France had was making a kind of preview for the world of something that could happen more largely. And another thing that I kept talking about in those 20 last years is that people kept telling me, tell us about the new anti-Semitism. You know, this is how people started to call these new waves coming from other political realms of other population. And I kept telling them there's no such thing as a new anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism is always good old anti-Semitism. What I perceive, and I keep trying to teach about it, is that there's no point in trying to define who is anti-Semite and who is not. What I truly believe is that our societies today are, I don't know if the word exists in English, are ventriloqued. Is there something like this in English? Like, no. Ventriloqué. Pas facile, hein? Like, they're... You should invent that word in English.
Ventriloquated.
Ventriloquated. Yeah. This is what it means. Is that it's as if anti-Semitism is like a language. I think that's the most useful metaphor for me. Anti-Semitism is a language, and sometimes it's spoken by people who are not anti-Semites. And if you ask them, do you hate Jews? Obviously they would not. But something of this language is spoken through them, through their words, through their bellies. Do you know, just like in a ventriloque is someone that moves his lips and something talks through him. And I often feel that anti-Semitism is okay, you will accept this new English word in your dictionaries. It is ventriloquated by anti-Semitism. And it's very, very difficult to fight because people who speak that language, most of the time, would deny they have anything to do with that language. It's really like an anti-Semitic tones that has captured their body or their mouth or their ear. And I keep thinking about it. And the other thing that I keep thinking about is the absolute power of anti-Semitism, which is its plasticity. Anti-Semitism is the most plastic and mutating phenomenon that you can think about. It has a capacity to evolve in different contexts and to speak tropes and elements of language that will adapt themselves to specific situations. Let me give you a few examples. A long history in societies where there were fears of contaminations, Jews became the agents of polluting, poisoning the wells, contaminating society. In societies, for example, just like European societies of the 40s of last century, when the ideal was an ideal of strength, fascist strength, or virility, you can be pretty sure, and it is what happened, that the Jews became feminine elements of society. Jews have been accused quite all the time along history of being just like women. They love money, they love being close to power, they're not reliable. The misogynistic elements against women are exactly the ones you find against Jews along history, because they've been feminized agents in society that revered virility. In society who are obsessed with purity, which is the case in many fundamentalistic society, Jews become really the quintessential impurity. In societies we want to move on with, communist agenda, they become elements of capitalism. If they believe in capitalism, they become Bolshevik. It's always, the capacity of the anti-Semitic discourse to transform the Jew is quite amazing. In a society just like ours, where women's rights are on the front line and there is a strong denunciation of patriarchy, abracadabra again, hocus pocus, Jews become suddenly alpha male, the Israeli soldier, powerful and virile, which is interesting because a century ago they were feminized, and today they're kind of very often virilized in the discourse. Same thing with societies when they become very thinking about privilege, domination, colonial sin. Jews become the quintessential colonial sinner. And I can bet that if tomorrow or in 10 years the question is about and will be about environmental crisis, you can be pretty sure that Jews will be accused of being the polluting agents of planet Earth. It's pretty clear. So actually what does it say? And again, I think what I'm saying now is quite obvious historically. It says that anti-Semitism never says anything about Jews, about who they are, about how they behave. It always says something about the society where anti-Semitism is expressed. So it says everything about the existential crisis our societies are going through, about their inability to deal with their breaches and their fragility, and the way the group tries to unify around what appears to be the broken, scar elements of society. So as a conclusion, because I think I talked for too long, as a conclusion, I just add two short things. The first one is, again, I think an obvious one, is that when we fight anti-Semitism in our society, I think the time has come to stop asking the Jews how they feel and how they react. In the past days, I've been invited to so many TV sets and media. People ask me what I think about anti-Semitism, and I keep telling people that just ask someone else. Why would you ask the Jews to react to this question? Actually, it's everything. It should be everything but my problem. It should be really a collective problem where you don't need to invite Jews to give their voice about that topic. And the second thing I would like to say, and now I'm putting back on my rabbinic hat, is that I think there's also a huge element of theology that now needs to be convocated, that needs to be invited to the debate. We talked yesterday in the morning about millennialism and messianism and the rise of millennialism everywhere in our society, politically and religiously. And I'm convinced that this rise of messianism always goes hand in hand with anti-Semitism. and the rise of anti-Semitism. Why? Because actually millennialism and messianism is an attempt to end the world as it was, to precipitate for some people the end of the world. If you want to precipitate, to accelerate the end of the world, or to put a dead end to the world as it was, it forces you, if you want to see the end of the story, to look back at the origin, at the beginning. And theologically, anti-Semitism is always linked to a problem with your origin. I mean, for Christianity and for Islam, the relationship to Judaism is actually a questioning of how it began. What was at the beginning? You know, the very fact that Judaism appeared before brings each religion, and I think sometimes unconsciously, each one of us is led back to the question of how we deal with our impure origin, with the fact that there was someone before us somewhere. And it leads me to the last theological idea I would love to develop, not now, but if we have time, is the question of purity. Actually, we know that the world we live in today is not only obsessed with millennialism, but is also obsessed with ideas of purity and authenticity. It's true in the religious discourse, but it's all true also in the political discourse, and maybe you'll talk about it, Yasha, but people are obsessed with being truly themselves, authentically themselves, which is always an obsession of purity, and purity, especially in the religious realm, is always a lie. There's no such thing as a pure idea, as a pure practice. And this is the core theme that fundamentalists and fanatists love to define their belief or their body or their theology as something pure. And it's not only always a lie, but it's a guarantee for all of us somehow to die. Thank you. So according to French law, we are not supposed to count population, but we consider that there are approximately 500,000 Jews in France today. So it's the largest Jewish community in Europe after Russia. There's Russia, but in Western Europe, France is the first Jewish community.
It's gone down a lot in the last 20 years. I used to always think like 900,000 was
No, it was always estimated between 400,000 and 600,000. Yeah.
Yasha.
Thank you.
Really consider rabbinical preaching at some point.
That is a hard act to follow. I'm going to talk about a topic that, in the first instance, is completely unconnected to everything that Delphine has been talking about, but that I think in the last weeks has shown how connected it is in certain respects. And so, on the first half of the talk, I'll talk about the broader topic without making the connection. And in the second half, I'll try to make the connection to some of the things that Delphine has just so movingly and eloquently presented. So in researching my new book, and The Identity Trap, one of the really striking moments was when I talked to a woman called Kyla Posey, who is an African-American educator in the suburbs of Atlanta who has two young kids who are 7 and 9 years old. And she asked the principal of her school whether she would be allowed to choose a teacher in a classroom for her kid, which is a privilege that the school sometimes gives to parents. And the school said, sure, just tell us which teacher you prefer and we'll make it happen. She sent in her request, and suddenly the tone of the principal changed, and she kept deflecting and not really giving an answer. And eventually Kyla got frustrated and said, look, what's going on? I told you the teacher I want for my kid. Can she go to a classroom or not? And the principal said, well, that's not the black class. Can't you suggest a different teacher? Kyla Posey said, what do you mean? This sounds like a story, a straightforward story about sort of racial discrimination in the American South, of which we've seen many in American history, right? Until you learn some of the details. The key detail being that the principal in this particular case is also a black woman, and a black woman who's been trained and who deeply believes in a new set of progressive pedagogical ideas. One of which is that the purpose, as a very influential organization called Embrace Race puts it, of a good progressive education is to make sure that children think of themselves as racial beings, and that the way to achieve that must be for them to have a peer group that is minimally and ideally, to a large extent, composed of other members of the same identity group. Carla Posey was very shocked by this. She told me about watching the inauguration of Kamala Harris with her daughters, and one of the daughters said, one day I'm going to be vice president, and the other daughter said, no, I'm going to be president. She said, who knows whether that turns out to be true, but they're going to go out and they have opportunities, they're going to go out and be people in society, and then going to need to be able to get along with people from all walks of life. Who is this principle to choose for me and my kids, who their friends are supposed to be? I just start that as an anecdote to show that the subject of my book is, I think, a real one. That we're really talking in important ways, not just about the political principles that we're adopting, but many of the social practices we're adopting in the heart of society, and about the ways in which these can, I think, turn out to be deeply counterproductive. So to those of you who don't know me or my work very well, I like to say that I'm a democracy crisis hipster. I was worried about the crisis of democracy and the rise of populism before it was cool, and a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been on that topic. And so it may be surprising that for this book, I've turned to a rather different topic, which is the rise of a new progressive set of ideas about race, gender, and sexual orientation, about what's often called wokeness, for I prefer the more neutral term, the identity synthesis. But the reason for that, as I point out in the title of the book, is that I do think these ideas are a very serious trap. They end up, like this practice in Atlanta, being very counterproductive and damaging precisely to the aspiration of building a more fair and equal society in deeply diverse countries, whether it's France or the United Kingdom or the United States. Now, part of the metaphor of a trap is that it has a lure, right? Is that that's something in a good trap that attracts people to it, a piece of cheese, if you will, right? And the lure in this ideology is that it makes the claim that it is the most radical, consistent, uncompromising attempt to fight against and overcome injustices that are undoubtedly real, that certainly exist. And I don't in any way deny, in fact, emphasize the persistence of forms of racism and sexism and homophobia in our society. But the argument I make in the book is that this ideology is not, as some of its critics sometimes like to say, going too far in the right direction, being too uncompromising in pursuit of the good. It is actually taking us in the wrong direction. It is, in its essence, a rejection of the best ideas and values in liberal democracy, and more specifically in the American story, that has allowed us to make progress, including some of the best ideas of activists who organized identity groups, but in the name of inclusion under a universal set of principles. It is, in fact, explicitly a rejection of the ideals that motivated not just Martin Luther King Jr., but the entire liberal black political tradition from Frederick Douglass to Barack Obama. So let me tell you a little bit about the nature of a trap, its history, the way it's applied, and some of how we can boil it down to its core claims and how I think we should respond to it. And all of that is going to be the first half of the talk, because then I want to apply all of it to what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 weeks. So I'm going to try and get through a lot quite quickly. This ideology is a trap for primarily political, but also for personal reasons. It is a trap because, as we've seen in many explicitly progressive advocacy groups, but also many progressive-leaning organizations like some of the ones represented at the table today, it has made it much harder for many institutions in American life to effectively do their job. We've seen the deep meltdowns at many progressive organizations in the United States in the last years that actually made it harder for them to pursue their missions because of the influence of ideas and norms inspired by this ideology. As one progressive leader said, we're spending more time fighting each other than actually serving our cause. It is a problem because of the social practices that I've only just started to describe by citing the example in Atlanta. More broadly, there is now, for example, a rise in the use of racially separated affinity groups in a vast swath of schools, not only but predominantly in the elite private schools of the country. And we're not talking here about adults or even high school students at the age of 15 or 16 choosing to spend some of their time with their peers, which is something that they should be able to do in a liberal society because of freedom of association. We're talking about practices in which explicitly in a mandatory manner or in a manner that is effectively mandatory in that situation, they are told to identify by identity in the kind of way that Delphine pointed out is one of the freedoms we should have not to be seen in that way. So I have a good friend who on the first day at his university education at Columbia was part of an orientation that I suppose was not technically mandatory. He could have walked out of a room without being expelled from university, but he certainly felt it was mandatory in that situation. All the students were there and it would have been very strange to walk out the door, in which he had to go either to a Black affinity group or to a Latino affinity group. And since his father is Black and his mother is Puerto Rican, he felt he had to choose between his two different identities on the first day of university and embrace this monolithic idea of who he is. We have this now in a vast number of elementary schools around the country. So these are places where teachers come into the classroom when children are 8 or 7 and 6 years old and tell them to go to one classroom if they're Black, and the second classroom if they're Latino, and the third classroom if they're Asian American, and the fourth classroom when they're white. And the concern I have with that is not only, but again, it chooses people to have this monochromatic understanding of their identity when their belonging in a particular group might be more complicated. It is that everything that we've learned from history and social psychology, everything I write about in my last book, The Great Experiment, suggests that this is going to backfire. I'm particularly worried about the white students, not because they might be uncomfortable, being uncomfortable in your education is perfectly fine, but because what we've learned from history and social science, what we can observe around the world today, is that how you identify is quite malleable, changes from situation to situation. But once you identify by one particular group, you're going to favor the interest of the in-group over that of the out-group. You're often going to be courageous, perhaps generally altruistic in how you deal with members of the in-group, and often indifferent and sometimes violent towards members of the out-group. And so the idea that if we embrace these kinds of practices at scale, we're going to create great white anti-racists to denounce their white privilege is, I think, thoroughly naive. What you're teaching kids when you split them up into a white group at the age of 7 or 8 is that whiteness is their most important identity, and like any other identity group, they're then going to fight for the interests of whites. This is a trap politically because it often leads us to disastrous public policy choices that actually, in some cases, have made everybody worse off. One of the pushbacks I receive when talking about this book is that this is all kind of Twitter discourse, so it's all these abstract ideas. These ideas now influence US government policy at the highest level. And perhaps the most extreme and shocking example of that was the way that the United States ended up distributing vaccines for COVID. As we know from the statistics, by far and away the strongest driver of serious illness and mortality for COVID was age. And as a result, virtually every country in the world, when we finally had these life-saving vaccines that were not some conspiracy, was first to give it to hospital workers because we needed hospitals to stay open, but in the second instance to give it out by order of age. And that also had the advantage of being much more practical, because it's easy to communicate. If you're over 85, you're eligible today. If you're over 80, you're eligible next month, and so on and so forth. Right? At the key meeting, which I sat through, of ACIP, the key advisory group to the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, scientists suggested that this would be unethical and needed to be rejected because older Americans are disproportionately white. And so as a result, they suggested putting essential workers who are a more diverse ethnic group first. This was adopted in modified forms, somewhat attenuated form by each state. So there's 50 different regulations, but nearly all of them ended up not prioritizing the elderly in the way that virtually every other country in the world did. And as a result, there's huge political jockeying for who counts as an essential worker. Movie producers in LA ended up being essential workers. Finance executives in New York ended up being essential workers. Me and our friend Anne ended up being essential workers in the state of Maryland because we teach together at Johns Hopkins University, even though we weren't allowed to teach in person. And what happened is that a vast number of people was eligible when there was very few slots, so nobody could get slots. And if you were privileged and highly educated, you kept refreshing the website, and you had networks to tell you where there happened to be a slot. A friend of mine, programmed a computer macro to nab those slots on the CVS website before any human would be able to click on them. People drove 2 or 5 hours to some rural area in their state where there was still availability, right? So who ended up getting those vaccines? Precisely the most privileged. And in the end, I'm quite convinced that more non-white people died as a result of this policy, because the stats indicate quite clearly that if you give vaccines to 2 25-year-old Latino Uber drivers, rather than one 80-year-old Latino retiree, more Latinos are going to die. So again, the stakes of this are real. And the stakes are real in a more partisan political sense as well, because, as I show in one part of the book that I won't talk about today, the reasons why this ideology became so influential in the left and became so hard to argue against in the left was in part Donald Trump's electoral victory in 2016, which made everybody who argues against these ideas suspect of running interference, in the lovely American sports metaphor for Donald Trump. But conversely, today, the reason why Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden in key battleground states, as we've seen in some of the major polls over the last days, and the reason why more Americans say, I disagree with his judgment, but more Americans say that the Democratic Party is too extreme than say that the Republican Party is too extreme, has to do with the dominance of these ideas in the entire universe of left-leaning and facially neutral mainstream institutions in the United States. And we have good evidence of that. So Nate Cohn in the New York Times had a good analysis over the summer of the different tribes of Republican voters. And one key tribe, about 10% of the Republican electorate, is predominantly young, predominantly non-white, predominantly quite progressive on social issues, but really concerned about what they call wokeness in American institutions. So it might feel tempting to think we have to choose between fighting far-right populism on the one side and fighting this ideology on the other side. But in practical and political terms, one of them is the yin to the other's yang. They actually end up mutually reinforcing in terms of how we polarize our public discourse. Let me say for a moment, I was wondering whether we would skip this part, but let me say for a moment, but I think it's also a personal trap. Because what I see very strongly in the students I teach, who are reasonable and thoughtful people, but who are swimming in the water of this ideology, who've been taught to think in these terms since day one in the United States at this point, is that the social recognition we all seek, right? The attempt of being seen in society we all seek, is, they are told, to be obtained principally or primarily through the particular intersections of identities at which they stand. That is how you get the visibility and the recognition that we all, I think, seek in society. That's what we're taught. And the problem with that is not just that it's an insecure identity, because there's always some way in which you might feel that your particular mix of identities is being devalued. And we see that the fancier people are in the United States, the more likely they are to think that. But it's that you will never be merely defined by your intersection of identities. My brother has a very similar intersection of identities than me. But if I was seen in exactly identical terms as my brother, if I was seen merely by what puts us at the same intersection of identities, I would not, in fact, feel the kind of social recognition and so on that we seek. So the problem is not, as some conservatives like to say, that the young people these days think they're unique little snowflakes. It's that we all think we're unique little snowflakes, but the social practices and norms that we've adopted in the American elite are not, in fact, conducive to people being seen in their individuality in that way. Okay, so in the book, it has 4 parts. The first is an intellectual history. One of the remarkable things about this moment is that there's sort of polemical attacks on this ideology from the right, silence about it in a lot of the mainstream where we don't like to talk about it too much because the word woke is a lot weird and we don't want to sound like we're foaming at the mouth, and then just acceptance of this as the natural truth on the left. And as a result, there's no serious intellectual history of this movement, which is remarkable. So I try to provide a serious intellectual history of the movement in part 1 of the book. In part 2 of the book, I say, how is it that we've gone in 2010 from this ideology being deeply influential on campus, but marginal to society as a whole, to it being really influential and dominant in many of our institutions in the United States by today? What is the set of sociological, technological, political reasons for that? In the third part, I critique in a philosophical manner the application of these ideas to many key areas of American life. I argue against the idea that if you stand at different intersections of identities from me, we can't understand each other. Which often goes hand in hand with what Delphine was talking about, with a claim that I can speak on behalf of a group, of a way to be a political ally is to defer to you as a representative of your group. And so therefore, if I want to make a political claim, I have to say, as a Jew, as a gay person, as a whatever. I argue against the very influential in cultural circles and in book publishing and in Hollywood idea that forms of mutual cultural exchange are a dangerous form of cultural appropriation. But there's this vast category of things considered cultural appropriation that we should stay away from, arguing that both misdescribes what was wrong about particular historical injustices, doesn't point us towards how to remedy them, and puts under a general pole of suspicion forms of mutual exchange and inspiration that actually are something we should be proud of rather than worried about in deeply diverse societies like the United States and Britain and France and so on. I argue for a genuine culture of free speech, the need of which has become clear, among others, in the last 3 or 4 weeks. I argue against the pedagogical practices of educational separatism I've talked about, and against the influence of the idea of equity, which has now supplanted ideas of equality in much of our political discourse. Since I'm conscious of time, I'll just leave you to imagine these parts of the book, and I'm very happy to talk about them in greater detail. I have a whole intellectual history in particular that I think is quite interesting, but
if you don't have time for the whole book, he has this wonderful exchange with Coleman Hughes on Yasha's own podcast that goes quickly, where he's sort of interviewed. It's very rich, it's faster.
But what I do want to do, and I'm afraid to say that's a substantial part of the talk, is to make all of that relevant to what's happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks. One of the striking things about being at an American university right now is that universities have gotten into the very bad habit of making comments about everything that happens in the world. In the last 10 years, the universities I'm affiliated with, have made immediate and loud comments about everything from the war in Ukraine to criminal trials whose outcomes they disagreed with, to Supreme Court judgments about things like affirmative action they disagreed with, to shootings somewhere in the local community, to minor expressions of bias on campus or close to campus. These have become a very, very regular feature of campus life. And yet, after October 7th, after the murder of over 1,400 civilians, including babies and grandmothers, the worst slaughter of civilians, of Jewish civilians since the Holocaust, those universities fell conspicuously silent. It was only after broad public outrage that they made any kind of statement about October 7th. And more broadly, we have seen in the intellectual and the cultural sphere a remarkable unwillingness to name what Hamas did. Now, I think it's perfectly fine to have a complicated, nuanced view of the conflict in the Middle East, and I certainly think that every civilian victim should be mourned in their own right, whether they're Palestinian or Israeli. But if you are calling for a ceasefire and blaming Israel for the entire situation, and you cannot bring yourself in that form of expression to acknowledge the horror of what Hamas did or to call for the release of the hostages, then I think you have committed a grave moral error. There's a difference between demanding of Muslims who are not political actors to denounce Hamas, which is something that is inappropriate in the same way in which it is inappropriate to demand of random Jews to denounce Israel. But and my eye here is much more against the non-Muslim and non-Palestinian intellectuals and writers and artists and university professors. You wade into the conflict, you sign an open letter actively expressing your political views about the conflict, and you cannot acknowledge the basic fact that Hamas perpetrated this terrible terror attack, then I think there's something important missing. And I hope we can agree on that. Now, why is that? Why is it that the left has been so shockingly unwilling? That a lot of our artistic and journalistic and rightly mainstream has been so unwilling to acknowledge these attacks. I think the reason is partially rooted in anti-Semitism, and it's partially rooted in a lack of clear thinking in which many of these people could not distinguish between the general complexity of a 100-year conflict and the moral clarity of the wrongness of what Hamas did, and you can acknowledge those two things at the same time. But I do also think it is because of the influence of the basic forms of this ideology on our thinking. And I want to explain how that is for a moment. Some of the ideas that I discuss in the book are, number one, that you can know the moral status of people by the group in which they are part, and that in particular, you can divide the world into whites on the one side and people of color on the other side. But historically, whites have been the perpetrators of historical evil. People of color have been the victims of it. Number two, that you can split the world into colonizers and the colonized, and in particular that the right image of what it is to colonize is settler colonies. And that therefore the right metaphor for the behavior of Israel is basically the United States and Australia. And that justifies any form of resistance. Number three, that we need to dispense with an older conception of racism. That the older conception of racism was based in negative views you have in the first person about another group. Right? What is to be racist to say members of group X are inferior, immoral, bad, dishonest, whatever it is that you believe, right? There's a right recognition that there's a form of structural racism which don't require that form of first personal bias, which is correct, that if cabbies don't pick up African Americans, this is a slightly old example before Uber and Lyft, they may not have racial bias against African Americans, they may merely believe that they're more likely to go to a neighborhood where it's going to be harder to get the next cab fare, but as a result, African Americans suffer from a form of structural bias that we might call racism, that is right. But there's then a move, as Vice Magazine has recently said, to say it is impossible to be racist against white people, right? That if racism is not structural, it doesn't exist. But racism is exclusively structural in nature. And that means that it is impossible to do something racist or unjust against a member of a dominant or majority group. And these ideas are then applied to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So Jews are white, they are colonizers, and as a result, it is impossible to perpetrate injustices against them. There's no such thing as a Jewish civilian. Even the babies who were slaughtered in the most sadistic way by Hamas had it coming to them because they're settler colonialists, as some people have explicitly argued. Now, I'm no great expert in Israel or the Middle East, but just to briefly point out that this application of these categories is vastly simplistic. That the status of Ashkenazi Jews as white should be rather in doubt when you look at European history and the way they were exterminated by the Nazis. But certainly there's no point in claiming that Mizrahi Jews who have origins in the Middle East and whose skin color is roughly that of the average Palestinian are somehow whites and Palestinians are somehow people of color. This is simply nonsense of the first degree. That whatever the complicated nature of the origins of the conflict, to say that those Mizrahi Jews, which are now a plurality of Israeli Jews, are colonizers when in fact they were expelled from Middle Eastern countries since 1945 with nowhere else to go, and went to the only country that would take them in. The idea that this is analogous to settler colonies where people chose to leave their countries in order to go settle supposedly virgin land obscures more than it reveals. And finally, that makes both moral and empirical nonsense of the idea that somehow a baby born to such a family in Israel has it coming to them because they're these settler colonists. Imposing this ideology on the world is a huge act of oversimplification. Let me close just by connecting this a little bit more to what Delphine has been saying. The sense of betrayal that you spoke about, I think, has started to grow in the United States, in the Jewish community as well. You talked about the murder at the Hypercacher. In the United States, there was a set of murders in Jersey City, which for a long time was not covered by the media as anti-Semitic in motivation because the perpetrator was a Black Hebrew Israelite. And the newspapers did not seem to be able to capture in their mind that somebody who's non-white might be anti-Semitic, that the motivation for this murder might be anti-Semitic, even though the murderer had very clear anti-Semitic statements on his website, on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. In the last days, we have seen the murder of a woman called Samantha Woe, the head of a synagogue in Detroit. The motivations for this murder are as yet unknown, as is the identity of the perpetrator. But the police, after 2 days, without knowing anything about it, so far as we know, they have no indications at all as to who committed the murder and under what circumstances. This happened a few days after October 7th. She's a very identifiably Jewish person in her community. The police ruled out an anti-Semitic motive, and there has been virtually no major press coverage of what is going on. I have seen no investigative report. I have seen no public outcry. I think to imagine that if this was the leader of a different religious community, one that is coded not as being white and dominant, but as being non-white and marginalized in the United States, in a context where there's obvious reasons to suspect that there may be a religious or racial motive, the idea that newspaper reporters wouldn't be tripping over themselves in Detroit trying to figure out what is going on is, I think, fanciful. And so the unwillingness to see these kinds of things is now similar in the United States. And so as a result, in a podcast I did the other day, I came up with this idea that I want to run past you, Delphine. This phrase suddenly popped in my mind that what we may be seeing is a Europeanization of American Jews. That American Jews, as you hinted earlier, were saying, this could never happen here. We are secure in this society in a way that Jews in Europe have never been, at least since the Holocaust and before. And I'm struck by the extent to which many Jews in America suddenly feel like French Jews have felt for a long time. Have felt for a long time.
Thanks to you both. Maybe you want to weigh on that just briefly, and then let's go to Mark, who did the book Hate, next, okay?
No, just on your last sentence, it's interesting. I totally agree with the idea of Europeanization of American Jews, but it's interesting that actually I started my speech suggesting that there is an Americanization of the European Jewish discourse, and the fact that suddenly in the past years, even though I live in France, in the French laïcité, French Republic, where I'm supposed to speak as a French citizen and not as a Jew, I keep repeating when people interview me or ask me a question, I have to start my sentence by, I'm not just a Jew. You know, when I speak, I'm a Parisian, I have children, I love sushi, I don't go to the gym. You know, I could define myself in many, many ways. But the fact that identities are suddenly reduced to like something so impoverished is quite striking for me. Also, listening to you, I have a few things that came to my mind. I wrote a book about anti-Semitism a few years ago. I think it's published in the States now. And it's I try to define there the difference that is not very easy to define between racism and anti-Semitism, because very often people use in Europe both words as interchangeable. Racism is very often, as you said, a kind of complex of superiority. You look at the other as being below you, not speaking the right language, not having the right skin tone, etc. Whereas anti-Semitism is, particularly today, built on the idea of a complex of inferiority, a kind of envy or jealousy that is very difficult to interpret. And the last thing that I have to share with you is that when the book was translated into English, to be released in America, I had a lot of issues because the translator refused to translate part of the book. For him, it was like, how would you call it in America, like sensitivity trigger.
He turned himself into a sensitivity reader.
Yeah, exactly. So he said, for example, he told me, and for me it was years ago, right, like 4 or 5 years ago, he told me, there's part of the book that I can't translate because they are anti-Semitic. I said, okay. So I guess I wrote an anti-Semitic book, and I said, give me an example. And the first sentence of the book in French was, I'll say it in French first, pourquoi n'aime-t-on pas les Juifs? Which is, why don't we, it was a joke, it was a Jewish joke, why don't we like Jews? It's a sentence by Lacan, the famous psychoanalyst, he said, pourquoi n'aime-t-on pas les Juifs? Parce qu'ils ne sont pas gentils, which is a play on word. Why don't we like Jews? Because they are not Gentiles, they are not nice. It's a French play on words anyway. So he said, I'm sorry, but in English, I cannot translate the sentence, why do people hate Jews? Because this is anti-Semitic. And I said, okay, so how would you translate the sentence? And then he sent me a proposal for the translation. He wrote, a long history in some places. Some people didn't like some Jews. I said, okay, that's a good one.
All right, we got Mark Weitzman, Marine Khan, Matt Kaminsky, John Ward, Caroline Viguera, Christina Lamb. Okay, so Mark. And maybe not in that order, Christina. You'll be all right. Come on, guys. Yesterday I messed up. We'll fix that. Now we'll fix that.
Yeah, I like to start with the laïcité thing. What Delphine said, the laïcité as an absolute fiction, to the fact that you can't totally emancipate from religious background. The laïcité concept in France has to do with the emancipation. You can't separate the concept of laïcité from the way Jews were emancipated during the French Revolution. There's a famous sentence. The revolutionaries in 1789, from 1789 to 1791, I think it was, discussed whether or not Jews should be citizens like every other citizens. What was a citizen? No one was a citizen in France during the ancient regime. People were subject of the king. So how do you make citizens out of subjects? And the model for that became the Jews, because there was no model, so they reached out to the Bible to find how Moses had made citizens from a tribe in the desert. That was the guinea pig, if you will, of the citizenship. And so the definition of emancipation, the famous definition was: give everything to the Jew as an individual, nothing to the Jew as a nation. That was the key sentence. So it was the victory of the I over the we. The Jew would become an individual, therefore a citizen, dotted with rights, political rights, social rights, and the we, the religious aspect, the cultural aspect of Jewishness, would be erased publicly and reserved for the family or the home, and would not appear publicly. That's a key thing for assimilation, and that's the problem today with the Muslims, of course, and with the migrants. And it's also the key issue, the key concept for laïcité. The religious thing is supposed to be reserved for the home, for privacy, and not being shown in public, and certainly not in public offices. I think, one of the possible explanation for this cultural difference between France and the U.S. especially is the fact that the U.S. is a country of migrants. In a country where the community matters because they come from somewhere else, you need to belong to a community of new arrivals, whether Italians, Jews, Latinos, and so forth. And the beauty of the American model for a long time was for me at least, and certainly for Jews of my generation who ended up being over-assimilated and looked to the U.S. as a model, was that you had it both ways in the U.S. On the one hand, the communities were acknowledged as such. There was the we. I come from a tribe, a Jewish tribe or an Italian tribe or whatever, and I sort of betray my tribe of origin to become a real American citizen. So it's this tragedy and the beauty of the productive betrayal, if you will, that you can see in Philip Roth's book, in Sal Bellow's books, in the Godfather's movies, for instance, is a story of a failure of betrayal. Michael can't betray his origins, and so he's back to the mafioso culture. So this was the beauty of the American model over the French one, because Jews especially were condemned to a sort of silence, especially after the war. The assimilation model failed to acknowledge what the Jews had been through during World War II. And so people of my generation had to fight in order to have that story acknowledged in the French public discourse. And by doing so, we ended up making the Jewish identity back in the open, if you will. And the model for that, for my generation, was clearly the American model. What happened since then? And why is not the American model working any longer? What happened in the American migrant culture? That's the big mystery to me. One of the possible explanations, this is just, I throw the idea in, is one possible explanation for the rise of what's known as wokeism and the emphasis on authenticity and authentic identity that have been discussed here. is perhaps the fact that, I mean, I'm wondering whether the modification of the Census Bureau in 2000 played a part or not in that evolution. In the US, the Census Bureau changed the way people identify. Until 2000, you had no choice. You had to identify yourself as either white or black, for instance. So after 2000, you could choose. Like Barack Obama, for instance, could decide that he's either black or white or not at all, nothing of that. That choice, I wonder to which measure this choice didn't start a huge identity crisis in the US. People didn't know how to identify any longer, and therefore it created kind of panic. That's my explanation for the way the political the culture of political correctness became wokeism after 2000. I don't know if it works or not, but it's just an idea that I'm throwing into the discussion. And finally,
I just wanted to comment on that briefly.
Yeah, sure.
It's not just that people didn't know how to identify. That wasn't the chaos. People who were half Asian and half black knew that they were half Asian for years. They just got to finally acknowledge it. The issue was a society that all of a sudden looks at their census and goes, oh, I didn't realize we had this many Asian people now. And so that was the chaos. It's communities realizing that things were not just as black and white, to your point, as they previously thought it was, or ever has been, because it's America.
Yeah, and also the fact that for the first time, and the demographic of children from the generation of the 60s, of the civil rights generation, that were half black or half white, or could be acknowledged by society for the first time as a group officially. And I think that played a part in the general confusion that ensued. That's all there is to say. That's all I'll say. I'll just finish on something about anti-Semitism. The difference, it seems to me, between anti-Semitism and racism is that anti-Semitism is the only form of racism that's a form of knowledge. It gives you, it's an existential form of hatred. It gives you an explanation to the world, how the world works. If you hate Asians, if you hate blacks, if you hate Arabs, or if you hate Muslims, it's just a fact of life. You just hate them. If you hate the Jews, you hate the Jews because they're responsible of the way the world works. It's a causal, it's a form of knowledge. It gives you an existential answer why things are wrong and how they should be corrected, of course, by getting rid of the Jews one way or another.
Thought on that? And then Marie next. Okay.
Just on part of that, I think there's a faulty premise in the explanation you try to give at the end, which is that this is an organic demand by migrant groups. And I just see no evidence of that. The best study by More in Common on sort of was widely cited in the press 4 or 5 years ago, and what they call hidden tribes of American politics, suggests that the tribe of what they call progressive activists, which is roughly speaking the people who believe in the ideas that are presented in the book, is disproportionately white, disproportionately affluent, and hugely disproportionately highly educated. In fact, that group is the whitest group except for the rightmost group, right? So the leftmost group and the rightmost group in American public discourse are the whitest groups. So I am trying very hard, and I know that I didn't have the time to go into detail here, to distinguish the set of ideas I'm worried about a much broader tradition of what you might, if you want, call identity politics in the United States, which is the heart of the gay rights movement that actually won things like gay marriage, or the heart of the African-American movement that won civil rights and further improvements afterwards. And I think those traditions are really importantly distinct from what we're talking about here, right? And when you go to the founders of that boogie word critical race theory, they make that extremely explicit. Derek Bell, rightly acknowledged as the most influential figure in critical race theory, says, I quote, we have to get rid of what he calls the defunct racial equality ideology of the civil rights movement, right? He makes fun of "We Shall Overcome," the famous civil rights era song, as a piece of kitsch that we need to throw out the window, right? Kimberly Crenshaw, in a paper thinking about why critical race theory had become influential in universities, but not yet at the time in the university as a whole, in society as a whole, in 2011, 2012, said, well, this guy Barack Obama was elected, and unfortunately, his political philosophy is fundamentally at odds with the key tenets of critical race theory, right? So this is an ideology that's much more radical than the traditional identity politics movements that have always existed in the United States. It distinguishes itself by a rejection of its universal principles, rather than what has historically been its calling card, by a demand for inclusion under those principles. And as a result, I'm a little skeptical about that upshot. And just to say one more word on this, this is something that I really think the American mainstream keeps getting wrong, which is this demographic fears. That I think the role of the Census Bureau is different. The Census Bureau led to these demographic fears on the right and this demographic triumphalism on the left, right? The idea that became popular in the latter Bush years and that seemed to be confirmed by Obama's victory, that whites vote for the Republican Party and non-whites vote for Democrats, and as the share of non-whites rises in the electorate, America is going to become naturally Democrat and it's going to be naturally super progressive. And all we need is to mobilize those groups and boom, we win, right? And the Republicans kind of bought this, right? Reince Priebus's famous report in 2012 after Mitt Romney lost to Obama was to say, hey, we need to increase our share of a non-white vote, clearly true. And the way to do that is to moderate and to embrace comprehensive immigration reform and so on, because there's always this shortcut that people have, that whites are right-wing and non-white people are left-wing. Even though most people in this room are white and most people in this room are left-wing, as it happens, right? And what actually happened is that Donald Trump delivered on the Reince Priebus report, just in a very different way. When you look at the poll that just came out in the New York Times, Trump is now within single digits of Biden among Hispanics. He now has over 20% support of African Americans, which is low, but much higher than the 8% that Republicans historically have been able to get. As Marion was saying yesterday, a lot of Muslims are tempted by the Republican Party in the United States. Muslims are mostly, but not obviously exclusively, non-white in the United States, because they are deeply opposed to some of the gender teaching that the Democratic Party has put in place in American schools, right? So I really think we need to distinguish between wokeness and advocacy by immigrant or non-white groups, because these two things often are diametrically opposed. And our inability to see that is at the root of our inability to see what's going on in American politics and why I personally believe that right now Donald Trump is odds on to win in 2024.
By the way, there's a very good book on what you just described called Where Have All the Democrats Gone, which just came out, which was written by the people whose first book spawned that myth. Which
We ran an excerpt of it in Persuasion yesterday.
Let's go to the economics editor at the Times. Nope. Over to the Christina Lamb at the Sunday Times.
Very collegial from the Times to the Sunday Times. I thought these two news.
She's showing her British identity.
Did you give that as a Brit? Let's do this question, and then we'll take a coffee break after your responses, okay?
Well, first of all, actually I have so many questions because that was so fascinating. I've run out of paper. I made so many notes. So thank you very much. And Delphina, I'm so sorry at what you're going through. But I was interested when you talked about anti-Semitism and the rise of it in recent years. You didn't mention 9/11 because as a reporter covering that in the Muslim world, everywhere I went, people told me it was Jews that were behind 9/11. They produced so-called evidence that the Jews didn't go to work on that day, and that was, and it was a Jewish conspiracy to besmirch Muslims, basically. So, to me, that was a sort of turning point in what I see on the ground. So I was interested if you would talk about that. But Yasha, goodness, where to begin? First of all, I wondered, isn't there some kind of pushback against this now, against wokeism? I wondered why you didn't mention the trans debate, because in the UK, that is the sort of centre of wokeism. It's almost impossible to write about it as a journalist because it's become so toxic. And so I thought perhaps you could just talk about that a little bit. And then as a foreign correspondent, sort of travelling, reporting from different countries, when I go and talk to students now at British universities, every single time I get told, isn't what you're doing white saviorism? And how can you justify why your thoughts valid on reporting these countries because you don't come from them? How can you understand?
White what?
White saviorism.
What's that?
That you somehow as a white colonial sort of person are going and thinking you can save people in other countries by reporting on their situation. I don't know, but I get accused of it a lot now.
And particularly people of color, usually.
Well, I answered very briefly to give you time. I could have talked about 9/11, but it's true that I chose to center on what happened to me as a French Jew, and I think very often when you testify about what you experience, it's always a kind of true autobiographical statement. I think come to my mind specific dates. I spoke about 1990 and the desecration, the profanation of the Jewish cemetery in the south of France. When you look at the historical map, it's like it's a micro event, in a way. And but for me, in my mind, at the time I was a very young teenager, it's truly a turning moment. I remember my father crying on that day, and so I guess it will remain for me a before and after moment. The way also probably the fact that this week I was telling you this morning. This week I asked my son to remove his Star of David, and sorry, I'm over emotional on those days. But I think this date should be in my personal calendar marking moment. In a way, that's my 9/11 in my family story. The fact that I saw a picture of my son playing soccer, and I noticed that his Star of David was very exposed, and I called him and I said, please, I'll ask you now to remove it. And so I guess everyone has today, not only every Jew, but many, many people today are experiencing their 9/11 in a way or another.
It's a hard pivot to the trans debate. I think perhaps because I end up being light on some of the things that I usually talk about and talking about the book to sort of connect it to this conversation, it is helpful to say something about what I mean by something like inclusion in universal values, right? So in the United States, when you look at one of the favorite political speeches that I'm sure every American in the room knows, perhaps some non-Americans do not know, Frederick Douglass's What to the Negro is the 4th of July. He calls out the hypocrisy of his fellow citizens, celebrating the idea that all men are created equal at a time when there's African Americans who are enslaved. And it might sound like he's saying, since these ideas are hypocritical, we should reject them. But then he pivots very clearly and says the point is not to rip up the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. It is to demand that we live up to its promise, that in fact, people like me are treated in accordance with the promises of these documents. So if you mean your ideals seriously, then you have to live up to them. That is the basic mode of how the gay rights movement made enormous progress over the last 30 or 40 years. So when you talk to people like Jonathan Rauch or Andrew Sullivan, who were the first to write essays in defense of gay marriage, when that was an absurd idea, right? When in public this is perceived as a completely fringe position. What they will tell you is the first fight we had to win was within the gay rights community. Because a whole radical wing of the gay rights community said, we don't want to get married. That's a terrible bourgeois institution. We want to rip up those institutions, right? We want to transform the mainstream. This is all oppressive stuff. Let's get rid of it, right? We said, no, the way we're going to win these debates is by saying, we're not different from you and me, right? The fact that I love somebody of the same sex doesn't make me different from you, and we love in the same way. We want the same security for our relationships. by what principle can you exclude us from that? Those are the arguments that have historically won. And now we get to the heart of a trans debate, which I talk about a little bit in the book. It's not probably about that, but I have a few pages about it. I think there's a heart to the trans demand for inclusion, which stands fully in that tradition and which I 100% endorse. And that is that obviously people who are trans have been terribly mistreated in the past, including the very recent past. If you look at the life story of somebody like the very interesting economist and now trans person, Deirdre McCluskey. And we need to stand up against that. And we obviously need to recognize people fully as equals and with dignity and respect if they choose to live as a gender that's different from that they're biologically born in. But a lot of the demands go beyond that, right? And so when you come to questions like sports, where you have people who've gone through male puberty and who therefore have significant advantage in sports, demanding inclusion of the highest competitive level in female sports. And people sometimes underestimate how vast the difference in performance is between men and women in many sports. You're not just asking for inclusion under universal principles, you're asking for the destruction of an existing category in a way where there's real trade-offs. Now, I think in most situations, if you acknowledge that trade-off, you can figure out solutions that are fine. Right? When you talk about 13-year-olds playing sports in school, and it's not, a dangerous contact sport like rugby, but, soccer or whatever, let them play together, who cares, right? But at the highest level of competitive sports, you clearly have a problem, and if you're not willing to acknowledge that trade-off, you end up in trouble. And so the problem with the radical ends of the trans rights movement is that it's gone beyond the demand for inclusion under universal rules. And that is one of the reasons why support for trans rights has in fact declined in the United States over the last 3 or 4 years. It's gone up vastly for 20 or 30 years, and then it started to decline. And that's because the movement went beyond the political demand that's not always winning, but that I think always can win, which is, by what virtue are you excluding me from the respect, consideration, rights, recognition that other people also enjoy, to making demands that go beyond that in a way that is, I think, normatively misguided and politically toxic.
There are no shortage of questions. Go ahead.
Yes, I think that is skin deep. That exists. We've seen, some much hyped examples of, the dean of Stanford Law School writing, 5-page essay saying that perhaps free speech isn't a terrible thing, and we've greatly celebrated that. I think what's happened is that the resistance against these ideas has formed a little bit, and that's partially, my book is a part of that. In all of the, not all of it, but most of the publications represented here, you could not criticize Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo for 3 or 4 years, even though secretly most of the people in this room probably thought that his ideas were not particularly sophisticated. And now, in part because of a big scandal at the center he runs at Boston University, but also because of broader changes in the public discourse, suddenly people were allowed to say what we've been thinking for 5 years. So there's some amount of pushback. And so I think the moment in which these ideas dominated without being able to be contested at all has gone. And I have to say that I've been positively surprised by the reception to my book and the ability to have conversations and debate about it in mainstream publications, in center-left publications, and all of that. But I think a year or two ago would not have been the case. Having said that, when I teach my students who have smart, thoughtful people, this is the water-based women. This is every institutional norm, every orientation training at the university, everything we've been taught in high school is to believe in this set of ideas. And you have, as I mentioned the other day, very mainstream publications in the United States continue to embrace unthinkingly or celebrate, explicitly some of the worst of these ideas, without any kind of self-awareness. So I think that this is going to be a 25-year fight. In the kind of way I argue in the book that the way to understand this ideology is not as cultural Marxism, but it's a complete historical misunderstanding. But there is one analogy to it, which is that the way in which a lot of intellectual space was contested between liberals and Marxists for much of the second half of the 20th century, I think our intellectual space is going to be a contestation between liberals and people who have embraced the identity synthesis for the next 20, 25 years.
We've got a full list of questions, starting now, I think, with Maureen Khan, unless you want to give it to somebody else.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Delphine, for explaining what's been happening over the last couple of days, because I think it's a temptation we could fly in and out of this country without really understanding what is happening right now. And I think my question is going to be directed at you. And maybe firstly, just a comment when you were explaining so much about asking your son to remove his Star of David and something that I think I've always been an advocate of trying to explain to people in Europe. So I was based in Brussels, that things that happen in France are really important for everywhere else in Europe. They have an outsized importance and we should care, because France matters in many ways, politically and also psychologically. And for me, that was always about thinking about how Muslims in France, what they go through, and this idea that visibility of religion is also somehow coercion, and how laïcité has come to work. And I think one of the big sadnesses is that Muslims are not being vocal about issues of anti-Semitism, and maybe some Jewish communities are not being vocal about Islamophobia, because this idea that this is a zero-sum game has become so deeply rooted in the way we think about how religious communities are impacted in secular societies. And I don't know how to reverse that zero-sum game, but it's just so obvious to me that we are fighting the same thing. And yet when Muslims say, I don't have skin in the game to be able to think about what's happening to my Jewish neighbors and vice versa, then if we can change that, I think a lot of change can come from that. And then my second point is about your sort of plea to think about theology, which is something that I'm really trying to do in this conflict, is by trying to talk to Muslims and Jews about all the things that are very special to us. And so when you mentioned that maybe like Judaism, because it is the first monotheism, there might be its origins are a little bit dirty, and I'm not going to speak for Christianity, but I think I can say very safely that in the Quran and for Muslims that's just not the case, and maybe Muslims don't even know this about their own religious book, that we are people of Abraham, who's perhaps the most important figure for all monotheists, but he is revered in the Islamic tradition. And a majority of the prophets in the Quran are Jewish prophets. The Bani Israel, the people of Israel, are special people. They have been chosen by God and are privileged by God. And the Quran sends a message and tells the stories of these people under Moses and the oppression of Pharaoh. And we share so much in this lineage. And Muslims, a lot of them know this, but we struggle to use this when we are conflicted about things over Israel and Gaza, to understand this. Jesus is a Jew who comes to earth to spread and reaffirm the message of the Torah and bring the Bible to the people of Israel. This is the Muslim lineage. We name our children after these prophets. So the question I have for you is that I would love to understand the role that Ishmael plays in the Torah. And I understand that there's not a unique or universal interpretation of the role of Ishmael, but given that you're a rabbi and I have the opportunity to ask you, I would love to understand the figure of Ishmael in the Torah, because I think it would help for me and other Muslims when we are doing this kind of outreach to understand our monotheism and our sharedness about who Ishmael is. The sibling. So Ishmael is the son of Hagar, the slave wife of Abraham. I'm sure everyone really knows this. Sarah is the mother of Isaac, who is the forefather of the Bani Israel, and through Jacob, the nation of Israel was born, and we share this kind of cousinhood. And so I'd love to know about how Ishmael works in the Judaic tradition, what role he plays, and whether he is a figure that can be used in these troubled times to try and understand why we're not so alien to each other.
Thank you. I love the fact that it becomes a biblical seminary or something. First of all, I think about your introduction. I think that today, more than ever, we need to teach people how to think against themselves. To be able to be criticized of their family, their heritage. And this is indeed something that for many people, it's very difficult today to speak against their tribe. It goes back to what Mark was saying before, that actually part of our culture should be an ability to think against your birth, in a way. Think against your tribe, against your immediate empathy. And it brings me immediately to the biblical character of Abraham that you just talked about. I mean, the three monotheisms claim that Abraham is their father and they want to be faithful to his heritage, Abraham or Ibrahim. But when you listen carefully to Abraham's story in the Bible, Abraham is the man who starts his journey by abandoning his father. He hears a call that says, leave your father's land, leave the place where you come from, betray your tribe. You know, the heritage of Abraham is an heritage of betrayal. You have to be able to think against your birth and your belonging to become someone else. And the name that Abraham, the moment he leaves his parents, becomes a Hebrew. And Hebrew, in Hebrew, means literally someone who goes from one place to the other. Ivri, in Hebrew, the word Hebrew, means that you abandon the place of your birth and you're on your way, la'avor in Hebrew, to another place. So the best translation, if I can play on that word, for the word Hebrew, is trans-identity. Abraham is a trans, literally, like he's in a transition from where he was to where he will be. And I find striking and actually terrifying that his children, who supposedly are supposed to promote his message, which is a message of become something else, think against yourself, are actually constantly promoting a message of stay home, stay with your tribe, don't move, don't criticize, don't go anywhere else than your birth. So I think it's very essential politically today that we go back to that theology and to always question our relationship to our original narratives. Today there is an obsession around purity, what I said before, the theology of purity and authenticity is everywhere around us. And historically and theologically, this is a lie. I mean, none of our practices today are pure. I can speak about, for example, the Jewish practices and the Jewish calendar. I keep talking about it in my talks today, but I think each religion and each theologian needs to do the same work in a way. If I take the Jewish calendar, I can today explore all the holidays of the Jewish calendar and relate them to a civilization we encountered, the influence that was exerted upon us through the encounter with otherness, like, for example, the Jewish holiday of Passover is totally influenced by the Hellenism and the Greco-Roman Empire. The holiday of Purim is an import from old Persian culture. And this is true of every holiday, of every belief we have. Just the way you said that Islam is deeply influenced by Jewish philosophy and Jewish literary heritage. But very often our theologians pretend that our origin is pure or is made of a disconnection from what was before. That's why, for example, for centuries, Christianity had to buy into the narrative of Verus Israel, pretending to be the true owners of the covenant. And that's why still in Islam today, many theologians claim that the Jews betrayed the text and that the Quran is actually the true version of something that was somehow made impure by the Jews or the Christians. So it's interesting that it's always a relationship to the origin that we want to contest. We want to pretend that something pure started with us. Which brings me to Ishmael, which is precisely a character that tells you this in the story. Jews on Rosh Hashanah, the very first day of the Jewish year, read a text from the Bible. So we say, okay, today is the creation of the world, first day every year of the calendar, Rosh Hashanah. What are we going to read? It would be obvious that we should read maybe Genesis, the creation of the world. But this is not what we do. Every year on the first day of the Jewish calendar, we read the birth of Ishmael, the first son of Abraham. And we actually give congregants and people in the synagogue and Jews who are coming to reunite on that day, we tell them, the story didn't start with you, because before Isaac was born, there was another son. There was someone else. And just beware that your calendar starts and your story starts with otherness, with someone else, with someone that is maybe just a cousin, part of the family, older brother, someone who disappears in the story. But be aware that you can never tell your story if you are not conscious that you are not the first, that there was another, a beloved one, someone that somehow is a ghost in your story that you will have to live with. And it's striking. We start the year with Ishmael figure. Ishmael is sent into the desert in this absolute unjust situation. Abram is sending to its death Agar and Ishmael, but they will survive, and God makes a covenant with them also. And Ishmael and Isaac, two brothers, will never, ever meet again in the text. Like they're separated at this moment. Ishmael is 13 when Isaac is born. They grew up a few years together. Then they separate in the Bible, and they never meet again, except in one place, in one time, when they come together to bury Abram. And there it's said, okay, you were not able to live together, but suddenly the two sons are able to bury their father together. And the way I would answer your question is that my hope, and I think the biblical hope, is that we're able to meet in places that are not cemeteries.
Thank you. I think of the many distressing things that I think came up with what Delphine was saying, one is the realization that outside the U.S. and Israel, it is hard to think of a place besides France where Jewish life lives as vibrantly as it does. That it's visible physically, it's visible in the cultural, intellectual life of the country. And as you were talking, I think we talked actually the first night about this, about the murder of Ilan Halimi. That's a personal aside, I was then living in Paris, and I was actually living in the 11th, a block away from Boulevard Voltaire, where Halimi's family owned a little cellular phone shop. These were just sort of merchants next to Place de la République. Down the street, you had all these kind of weird Chinese textile stores. It was that you walk a little bit further down, you hit the Marais, obviously, which is the historic sort of Jewish neighborhood, still is in many ways, in Paris. You go around the corner, you go past the Bataclan, which was obviously, became one of the places that was attacked in 2015. And after Halimi's murder, it was striking to me then that it seemed to have a sort of it was as shocking as the riots that had sort of taken place, I guess, the year before in Paris. And there did seem to sort of galvanize sort of great support for the Jewish community. And obviously at the official level, there were a lot of, I think the government very clearly said, we are, do everything to prosecute this. We are sort of supporting the Jewish community at the same time as there were calls for Jews to leave France, mostly from outside of France, that you cannot be safe in France. You have to go to Israel. You have to go to the U.S. Go somewhere else. And I guess as we come to this point in this story, in this moment, I guess the question that comes to my mind is, and it's to sort of state the very, very obvious, is that the difference between now and 1930s, between now and what is happening here and is happening in Iran, in the Middle East, is that anti-Semitism is not official policy, obviously. It is not something the state is trying to protect Jews, I assume. And I guess I wonder, do you see that changing? Is there some sort of diminution of sort of official protection support for the Jewish community in France? Are Jews possibly safer somewhere else than France? Is France kind of realizing that, last night, sort of that Michel Houellebecq sort of vision and submission that, that we're going beyond hate crime, even accounting for Marx's difference between anti-Semitism and racism, what we're talking about here are sort of hate crimes, narrowly speaking, not state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. But is that actually, is something fundamentally kind of changing now? Is it sort of being diluted? That's important anyway.
So it's funny, this morning I was reading in the newspaper an article saying that many Jews are trying to buy houses in Corsica today because they think that Corsica might be, because the island of Corsica, supposedly, I mean, its history protected Jews. It was an island of righteous among the nations. So many people are trying to, maybe the next meeting could be in Corsica. That could be, it's a beautiful place.
What's beautiful about Corsica is that if a Jew from Paris moves to Corsica, they'll be hated as French people rather than as Jews.
So I don't know where is the safe place, but you're right. There's something clear is that people very often ask, is the public power and the government protecting the Jews? And they are. I mean, it's clear for the past years, the way the Jewish community is protected and this political discourse about the protection, they need to protect Jews and the importance of Jewish presence in France is absolutely impeccable, we would say in French. Like it's perfect. But the problem is that it doesn't solve the situation. I witnessed myself this, I always have a problem with this American expression, catch-22. I always want to say catch-21. For some reason, it's 22. Okay. So a catch-22 situation that in recent years, my synagogue is under protection just like other important Jewish places in Paris, school, etc. And slowly, you witness the growth of a kind of victim competition discourse that people say, the French government offers protections for synagogue, but there was a wave of terror attacks that touched everyone, the Bataclan, and suddenly, slowly, you hear the little rengaine, like this little song, that's melody that suggests that, oh, look, the Jews, they're more protected than others. What about other minorities? They don't have the right connections to the power. And suddenly you hear the very old anti-Semitic trope of Jews have access to power, they manipulate the powerful, and this is why they are more protected. So you see the catch-22 phenomenon is that you're threatened as a Jew, so you're protected by the state, but then being protected, you need more protection because you're perceived as, that the anti-Semitism is on the rise, so you need more protection, so then the anti-Semitism is on the rise, etc., etc. So it's almost as if the French government needed to protect the Jews discreetly, without noticing, which makes no sense. And we get into this ridiculous phenomenon of protecting without saying. So this is, I think, where we are today. Also, another problem is that very often people who are buying into anti-Semitism or active in this anti-Semitism discourse are also the ones who hate government, public power, and the police. We know it today. There's a kind of, it goes together. And so, in a way, the help of the government strengthens, in their eyes, this weird alliance that they fantasize. So it's very difficult to end this. I would like to add one thing about what you said, that Ilan Halimi's assassination, that indeed, at the time, I think it was Ariel Sharon, who was the Israeli prime minister, sent a terrible appeal to French Jews at the time, saying, your protection in Israel, you should all make aliyah. At the time, for a French Jewish leader, it was terrible. I remember the chief rabbi of France, for the first time, taking a statement, a very strong statement, against Ariel Sharon and the government of Israel. But I think it has to do with what we experience today, in a way, is that I think part of the trauma that Jews around the world experience today is that being Zionist or not, envisioning to move to Israel or not at all, we all unconsciously accepted the fact that Israel played the role of a guardian for us, that actually the vulnerability of our condition in diaspora for the past 75 years has been, in a way, guaranteed by the existence of the State of Israel. as if the state of Israel didn't play the role of a government for us, but played the role of a guardian, a physical guardian for what could happen. And what was destroyed on October 7th, the extent of the catastrophe, has also to do with that on the Jewish psyche, like on the mental state of the Jews around the world, is that the vulnerability and the exposed absolute vulnerability of Israel shattered and destroyed this idea of Israel being an absolute and strong guardian for us. And it's as if, and it's weird for me to say that, it's as if on October 7th, Israel just entered back Jewish diaspora. You see what I mean? It's as if suddenly Israel was just as vulnerable as we are in diaspora, and it entered back Jewish history in a way we didn't expect.
The most difficult question, I'm going to start with it, is how to sort of get over the unease that is embedded in this whole discussion. And I, as a German, I grew up very much with what Olaf Scholz and Angela Merkel before him called Staatsräson, which is that, you know, Germany is by Israel's side, steadfast, always. Oh, this is really unsettling.
Turn it off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
And, you know, this was sort of something that was non-negotiable in post-war Germany, or certainly post-1968 Germany, where Germany began reckoning with its history and actually, you know, properly digesting it, asking questions of its parents and so on. And so I am of a generation that grew up with that very much. But I think what the questions that have that are being raised now in the context of this war as well are that people are questioning whether, does Staatsräson mean, you know, you support Israel, the state of Israel, unconditionally, no matter what the state of Israel does in terms of its own rule of law, in terms of, you know, the war crimes it may or may not commit. Is that commitment absolute? Do you have that commitment to the Jewish people because of the terrible history as Germany, but also maybe as the, you know, community of human beings in the world that is sympathetic? So this unease, I think, you know, Yasha, you said, why aren't university professors speaking out clearly and calling October 7th a terrorist attack and condemning Hamas as a terrorist organization? I don't know enough about that situation, but I suspect that some of them don't not do it because they don't believe that, but because they feel they can't say that and then in any way qualify immediately by saying, but also we condemn, you know, the disproportionate killing of Palestinian civilians. So it's almost like you're caught. It's almost you're better off saying nothing, because if you say one thing and then you qualify, you then also accuse of anti-Semitism because they're like, well, he's qualifying and he doesn't really mean it. So, you know, and Jaffa mentioned the pressure on Muslims in Germany to distance themselves from Hamas. Nobody's asked me to distance myself from Hamas as a German. Now, Jaffa is a German citizen, you know, and this sort of expectation that you have to make these things explicit, but the implication being that somehow you are already, if you don't distance yourself, you are somehow complicit or something. So I think what is really difficult in this debate is that, you know, for example, you mentioned that Jews are always accused of having access and special power, and it's obviously the oldest trope in anti-Semitism. I'm very sensitive to that, again, because of my upbringing. And yet, there's a fact, which we can't ignore, which is that on average, certainly in Germany, the Jewish people tend to be better off, more middle class, than, say, the Muslim community. And therefore, middle class people, you know, having more lobbying power in state schools and so on, tend to probably get better resources. I mean, schools are better for middle class people than not. And so, again, if you are a Muslim representative and you watch Muslim children in Neukölln in Berlin having really bad schools and, like, you know, maybe a situation where racism is rampant and not getting as much attention, it's very uncomfortable to, to sort of observe that difference. And so somehow, how can we create a more open discourse in which people are allowed to point out injustices on the other side without risking to be immediately called anti-Semitic? I think, and again, I almost wish for the Jewish community, because you guys have the biggest credibility in that context, to help with that in a way. Maybe to stand side by side with the Muslim community and advocate together. Yeah. Because I think that, and this is my last question, I think it's dangerous to just sort of call everything anti-Semitism. I've covered the far right quite a lot, the resurgent far right in Germany, and my instinct has always been to worry strategically in terms of the health of our democracies more about the white nationalist anti-Semites in Germany, the neo-Nazis that I've interviewed, who really take their cue from the Nazis. Then the youth on the Brandenburg Gate, shouting definitely anti-Semitic slogans and maybe even singing Heil Hitler, which is terrible. But I feel like, shouldn't we distinguish somehow? And again, should Muslims and Jews stand together to unpack the nuances there? Or are there no nuances?
But, talking first about schools, for example, and access to school, what you described from Germany, I would describe the opposite exactly in France. Currently in France, there are no children who are able to go to school in the suburbs of Paris because they've all been told that their security cannot be assured. So, the question of education could be even, verbalized in the opposite way in France. It's difficult to find a place in public school for your child if you're Jewish, because the director of the schools today say to Jewish parents, we cannot guarantee the security of your children. So, and also talking about, working to talk together, to be side by side, to be self-critical. I mean, again, I cannot accept this about my congregation or my Jewish friends, leaders in France. I think in the past years, I can't count how many times my friends and I have been super critical, supportive of the Palestinian cause, defending it, its legitimacy, being critical of the Israeli government, fighting settlements, But this is exactly my point, is that for the past month, I've been looking for my peers, my Palestinian friends in Paris, and I wouldn't find one voice to condemn Hamas, And again, I don't need them as Muslim to say that the way, what you said before, that as a German, you're not asked to say you're against Hamas. But there is a slight difference, is that people who killed on October 7th did it in the name of Islam. It makes a difference. When people do things in Israel in the name of Judaism, I have to stand out. I have to speak, Well, to give you an example, in recent years, settlers in Israel started to wear a specific head kippah, yarmulke, on their head, made of wool, like you probably saw that on the news. Settlers, they wear this specific identified kippah. And I said to my congregation, to my friends, there's no way we're going to wear this kippah again, because what they do there against Palestinians is made in the name of Judaism, and that's unbearable for me. And this is why theologically, culturally, I'm fighting. And I'm surprised, and surprised is a euphemism, that people let in the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian camp, let's say, group, I'm surprised that they let their cause be hijacked. And they let their religion very often be hijacked by this immorality. This is simply what I'm saying. And concerning unconditional support of Israel, Israel doesn't need at all unconditional support. Israel maybe, and maybe specifically from Germany, needs unconditional support for its rights to exist. But it doesn't need, and it would be really threatened, I think, by an unconditional support for its policy. And this is where, for me, the difference stands. I'm going to quote the Bible to share with you a quote that is the most, I would say the less well understood quote in the entire Bible. If you ask people what is the most famous quote in the Bible, they will probably tell you, love your neighbor as yourself. The idea of unconditional love for the other. And this is a mistranslation. Sorry, that's the big news for today. The Bible never says, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no such thing as unconditional love in the Bible. If you read the verse, it says the following. Be able to rebuke the other for what he did wrong. Don't carry the sin for him, but know how to distantiate yourself from the wrong he's doing and tell him why he's wrong, and then you will love your neighbor as yourself. So it's a totally different message than the one very often that, in popular culture we pretend to believe in. Loving someone means that sometimes you must distantiate yourself from his actions. You must tell him, you know what? Maybe you're wrong in what you're doing, but I'm telling you that because I love you, So this is the real meaning for me of the conditional support. No one needs an unconditional support for Israeli politics. And the first one who will tell you this are Israelis themselves. Those days when I call my Israeli friends, they are so critical of their government. They're very often the ones who call for a ceasefire, louder than my friends here in France. But there must be today more than ever, in this context of anti-Semitism, a clear affirmation of the unconditional support for Israel's rights to exist and to live in security.
There is, we'll get to Yasha here in 1 second, but there is this New Testament verse, Mark 12:31, that does talk about that. This is not all scriptures, but there is this line about living. Did he really live to 137, Ishmael? I get back to this.
No, not I don't know. I have to check his.
So there's more to come at lunch, okay? The Testaments.
So I'll say something similar to what Delphine said, but I'll say it a little bit more bluntly. And Katrin knows her well, and we like each other. I think you're blaming the victim. You're blaming the victim in a deep and profound way. And no, let me.
I'm not.
No,
Yasha,
Katrin,
just quickly.
Katrin,
I'm
let
not
me
blaming
say my
anyone.
piece.
I've asked a question, and the fact that you were already telling me that I'm blaming someone is actually almost proving my point.
Well, perhaps let me actually give my response. It is interesting what you said and what you left out. Part of it is, you're asking these professors to speak up. No, nobody has to speak up. I'm talking about the senior professors at Columbia University who chose to sign an open letter about this, who chose to speak out, and who called what Hamas did a military action, who did not mention the people who are still, over 200 people are still in the clutches of Hamas in one word, who did not condemn Hamas with one word, who called the sadistic murder of 1,400 people a military action. This is reality on American campuses, right? To speak more broadly, I'm sorry to say, when you enter the logic of saying Jews in Germany are more affluent than Muslims, what does that have to do with anything? I'm sorry, what does that have to do with anything?
But you're asking what does that
Katrin, let me finish
I was just saying the middle class in general, the white middle class, myself included, who lived in Steglitz and had a very nice state school with 30%, people with migrant backgrounds, good teachers, nobody ever, no substitute teachers needed because there was no vacancies, etc. Neukölln, if you are less middle class, you don't get the same.
And yet, per capita,
service.
Jews in Germany, France, and the United States are most likely to be victims of hate crimes. So, fine, Jews perhaps on affluent make more money. How is that relevant to the discussion of Jewish security in France at this moment? And how is that relevant to the fact that institutions that have condemned every attack on another group are unwilling to condemn an attack on this group? I think there you are deeply in the logic of Jews are white and they're privileged and therefore they don't count. Therefore, we're not going to look closely into what happened to Samantha Wall in Detroit. Therefore, we're going to be silent about the fact that per capita in the United States, Jews are most likely to be victims of anti-Semitic crime. And so
what I was trying to point out there, Yasha, sorry to come, because it's very personal to me.
Can I please?
Yeah, okay. But I just wanted to point out that the context in which I mentioned this, you make it sound like I make it somehow relevant, therefore somehow they deserve attack, whatever. I was mentioning it in the context of, underprivileged Muslims and their representatives clamoring for more state resources and pointing out the difference with perhaps more middle-class schools like Jewish schools, and therefore, and that's somehow immediately becoming an anti-Semitic issue.
I did not say you're anti-Semitic. That's in your mind, to be clear. But speak to some progressive Jews in the United States, right? Because what they feel, you're saying, why don't Jews stand up for Muslims? Look at the past statements of the Jewish community in Germany. Look at the past statements of Jewish communities in France. They stood with Muslims each time, right? Talk to some progressive Jews in the United States who feel that we march with Black Lives Matter. And what does Black Lives Matter do? They call for a protest before the Israeli reaction in Gaza had really begun, in which they picture a paraglider in an iconography that is celebrating it, invoking the people.
One chapter of Black Lives Matter. One chapter.
Two actually in LA as well. But why is it that the protests immediately after October 7th, before the Israeli reaction had begun, was not to mourn in any way the people being killed by Hamas, but immediately on the other side? And so I just think that when you have a very strong record of Jewish communities condemning that, when Jews are the people who per capita are most likely to be victims of hate crimes, when you have institutions like Harvard explicitly say that the DEI office does not apply to Jews or Asians, but to everybody else. And then the question comes, well, but don't Jews have more money, and aren't they more privileged in the schools and have more resources, and why don't they condemn, and wouldn't it be nice if they condemn? I'm sorry, Katrin, I think that is just fundamentally misrepresenting what is going on in this moment.
Can't talk about these things at Cap for Out. We're never going to talk about them. Let's go to Jafar, please, DW. And hit that button if you would, Jafar.
We already talked in the break, Delphine, about what you said, and really feeling sorry what you go through. And while you were talking, I remembered a scene that I had 2 weeks ago in my own talk show, where I had a representative from the Jewish community, and I had a representative from the Muslim Palestinian community. And the representative from the Jewish community was stating how it's hard for Jewish children to go today to school. And I also talked to some colleagues of mine who are Jews, and they told me the same. And then, at the same moment when he said his sentence, the other side from the Palestinian Muslim community answered, and he said, I've been getting messages from Muslim families who are afraid to send their children to school because some schools in Germany wrote, I stand with Israel. So they felt they are excluded, insecure, they didn't feel well. And I was in the middle, moderating, and then I went out of the talk show, and I was thinking, my impression these days is that expectations are so high from the others and on the others in all different ways, and we can see it the way we're discussing today. And I think sometimes dialogue is based on when we disagree. Like if people come together and or they agree all together, then it's not a dialogue. And that's why the question I'm searching for and trying to understand, and that's exactly why I went to the pro-Palestinian protest, and I will go to the other side protest, is to understand what's the one common thing that we can catch again and talk to each other, and are people ready to talk to each other even if they disagree? And if not, what could be the solution? Because wherever I'm in conversations, it's like football. You know, I'm for this, they play better. No, this is this. No, we are better. But what's the common thing? It's about people's life. It's about everyday's life. It's about human rights. It's about the basic things of every citizen, of every individual. So from your side, what are the requirements that you put or you say they should happen from the Muslim community, from Muslim organizations, in order to be ready to talk to them and find a common ground in fighting anti-Semitism, but not with racism, because that's what's happening by some politicians now in Germany. And this is not okay for whatever side. And would you be ready to say, yeah, we don't agree on things, and I don't have these requirements, but we have to talk, and not only to the secular Muslims, but also to the conservative Muslims who reach a higher community?
Yeah. Well, that's precisely what I've been trying a bit desperately to do in past weeks. I think I started my talk before saying that I'm more than ever looking in all directions to strengthen the dialogue. We are planning now, we are organizing next week a march in Paris where, like a white march, you say it in English, like people will walk without any flag or... Yeah. And I talked with the organizers yesterday, and I said they wanted to walk in the streets of Paris, and I said let's organize they wanted to walk from the Institut du Monde Arabe, like the Arab World Museum in Paris, and walk to the Jewish Museum in Paris. And I said let's do something else. We'll walk in both directions. And if you look at the Parisian map, the place where it meets between those two spots on the map are the bridges of Paris, like the bridges over the Seine. And there's something very symbolic of reuniting over a bridge, meeting over a bridge, because we need to find that bridge. So I'm looking to strengthen those conversations constantly. It's very difficult for me to find people to talk to in the mosques in France. I do have a lot of conversations with Islamologists, with Arab intellectuals. I can't find right now clergy, even though it's not the right name, members to talk to. But I'm strengthening those dialogues, which have to rely upon a basic feeling of empathy, what you were describing. The simple ability, 1 second, to put yourself in the place of the other, which is seems to be a basic human ability, but has disappeared. Many people in both camps, like this inability to have the minimal empathy for the other. So I think yesterday I received a text by a Lebanese friend who is the director of a theater in Paris. Wajdi Mouawad is the director of a very known public theater in Paris. He sent me a beautiful text where he says that he acknowledges today that there's nothing he can do personally about the Middle East. There's nothing most of us can do about Hamas, about Israeli settlers. We feel clueless. But there's something that we can do today is to assess how this impacts us, our humanity, and how we're not going to let that impact the kind of human beings we can be. That's the first thing he was describing. And then he described something that I thought was super powerful. He described how much, as a Lebanese person who was born in the 60s before the war, he left Lebanon during the war with his parents. And he said, my parents planted in me a lot of love and good things, but I have to acknowledge today that they also planted in me hate, and a certain level of hate that grows. And part of that hate, he says, is a kind of, he calls it an anti-Semitism flower. He has inside him an anti-Semitic flower that is there, the way I think each one of us has seeds of hate, flower that wants to grow from time to time. What happens to us today is this. Each one of us is putting, well, I have no water, but is somehow watering the hate flowers inside oneself. So the real question that we need to ask us is how we dry the land inside ourselves of that flower that is there. We are not going to get rid, and we know it. I mean, I speak so often with my Muslim friends, Arab friends, they tell me that yes, it's inside them. It's not politically correct to say it, but something in their education here and there resonates with the anti-Semitic tropes that they hear, but they're feeling that they can do something about it, and they have to do something about it. Not to deny it exists, the same way that inside the discourse of my Jewish friends today, here and there, I hear the flower of hate, but how do we make sure that we're not letting it grow? I mean, for me, that's the question. I myself, when I hear myself, I'm aware it sounds like super naive, and you see what I mean? It's not, but I have no other political religious advice for today, because I feel...
Let's get one last question from Joris, but preamble from Marine.
I don't want to be one of those people that just interrupt, but I am one of those people. I think there's a context in which Muslims in France feel utterly and totally besieged, and they have felt like that for many, many years because they have been subject to legislative assaults under the name of laïcité. So then when you ask a community which is not allowed to be Muslim in school or in public spaces, because your Muslimness is not allowed to manifest in public life under this rule, that suddenly you have to condemn something as a Muslim because somebody else somewhere else did something in your name. This is the asymmetry and all of the ironies that laïcité creates, that you're only a Muslim when you're asked to condemn bad things, but when you're a Muslim who wants to wear an abaya in a university, you have to take it off as a condition of entry into that place. So I understand that laïcité has become an article of faith, but so many ironies and paradoxes of the way it actually works in France. And I wonder how, as do Jewish people also feel that laïcité is a weapon that is used to strip them of their Jewishness in good times, but in bad times they have to be Jews again because they're being called on collectively to say something. And I think we can't talk about Muslims in France without thinking about the fact that they are accused of thought crimes, of separatism, of wearing clothing that is somehow not part of neutrality in France. But then we also need them to come and be strong when everyone else needs them to say sorry for something. I don't think you can sustain those two things at the same time.
May I just add just one thing?
Please.
Sorry. Just following on from that point, I think it's really important when we make statements like Hamas did this in the name of Islam to distinguish the experiences of different Muslim people and how they refract through where they sit, right? Arab Muslims in the Arab world do not consider Hamas a religious institution. They consider it a political one.
I'm talking about what Hamas says about itself.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas says many things about itself that is, propagandic and positioned within their own dramas with the Palestinian Authority, etc. Which actually you would be surprised how little a lot of Arab people do not even know. Like there are so many details that people are not across. The way it is expressed in the Arab world, support for the Palestinian cause in the Arab world, is expressed mainly via frustrations towards domestic governments, rarely about the Palestinian cause itself, which is something that I think many people have divested from for different reasons over the past 20 years. So if you look at the past couple of weeks, pro-Palestinian support in the Arab world, which is the kind of node of Islam and the Ummah, as far as Hamas is concerned, has been refracted through a very secular, almost post-Arab Spring frustration against governments, because that is the most pressing thing for Arabs now, right? In Europe, the most pressing thing for Muslims is where they stand vis-a-vis secular governments, vis-a-vis immigration policies, vis-a-vis Islamophobia, the legacy of the war on terror. These are big things. So I just think it's important that when we talk about a reaction of a certain bloc, what is demanded of them, what is asked of them, it is very variegated, and usually is through the lens of what is defining of that group's particular crisis at the time. I'll stop there.
Great. If you're bored, sit at Nesreen and Marine's and Rabbi Orvier's table at lunch. It's going to be great. Joris.
I'll just keep it short. I just want to give the perspective of a sort of committed bystander, because I'm not ethnically, religiously, or emotionally connected to the Middle East. But I lived there many years as a correspondent. And so I have many Jewish friends and I have many Arab friends. And after September 7, I've been sending text app messages saying, how are you holding up? How are you feeling? And if I don't see the name of my friend and I read the app, I cannot tell whether it's a Muslim or a Jew. because it's the same thing. You know, I'm crying, I can't be there for my children. It's so hard. I see these images and I struggle all day, and this is affecting me so deeply. And it's Jews and Arabs, the same. And I'm thinking, and then I'm talking to them, and basically they're struggling with the same question, which is, can we trust the majority? So I live in the east of Amsterdam, and there's a street next to mine, and 1,400 Jews were taken from that street alone. And so it's no wonder if, as a Jew, you would think, can I trust the Goyim? Are they going to do this again? Now, if you're a Muslim, you are in Europe, and I don't know about the US, but you are a second-rate citizen. The stuff that comes out of media, of politics, of the law, it is just astonishing. And people die from it. They don't die in spectacular ways, but they become depressed, they go into crime. It is absolutely ghastly. 25 million people in our continent, in the EU, are second-rate citizens. Now, internationally, who is the symbol of a second-rate citizen for whom there's no international law? And that's the Palestinians. So for them, it's also a metaphor. So it's in many ways, I feel that Jews and Arabs are being sort of played off against each other, when in what they really see from on that sort of projection screen of the Middle East is their own fate when the majority turns against them. And so I would think that as a sort of as a committed bystander, I think you can do, if you eradicate Islamophobia, you're also helping the Jews. And many of us here are journalists, and I'm struck by how little priority we give to the fight against Islamophobia. And we write columns and that sort of thing. And the less Islamophobia, the less systemic discrimination of Muslims, the more sort of the less emotion will be involved when looking at the conflict. And there's a real conflict there, and there's, you know, an end has come to the occupation at once. But I think this is where we could have a role, and don't let this be a thing between Arabs and Jews, and we just sort of sit back, because their emotions are informed by the treatment we as a majority give them.
I think it is right because of the reality across the way to just a closing comment, okay, 2 sentences a piece if you wish, and then we're gonna carry it on at the lunchroom, okay? So closing comment if you have one.
We'll continue at lunch our discussion probably, but I continue to strongly believe that the French laïcité is a blessing. And I think it's a blessing for everyone, for Jews and for Muslims in France. That's what I would probably disagree with you, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation. Just maybe I'll end with you know, there's in the Bible this episode that keeps ringing in my ear, and it keeps getting back to my mind and my soul, the fact that the Bible starts with the killing of a brother, that Cain assassinates his brother Abel, and the Bible says that Cain is obsessed, is jealous, he feels he's victim of an injustice, and God turns to him and tells him, you can do something about it, but if you let it be upon you, then sin is at the door, and then the next thing that Cain does is that he kills his brother, and then he hears this super famous sentence, popular culture. God asks him, what did you do? And he answers, am I my brother's keeper? And this sentence, am I my brother's keeper, resonates in me now for a month, that actually the killers are always questioning their own responsibility. And it's always somehow suggesting that someone else was in charge. Government, international situation, the victim himself. And I think that this is really, in a way, non-religiously, but ethically and philosophically, the question that we need each one of us to hear today, and to wonder simply how and will we be able, some way, to be our brother's keepers.
Just to connect this back to the broader conversation, which is the real issue of my book, I think all of this raises the question of how you sustain deeply ethnically, religiously, and so on diverse societies when there's going to be conflict, right? And there's going to be hard and emotional conversations and fights. And I think two things that are at the center of what my book is arguing for have once again become clear today, right? The first is that people will, and we can have our conversation and debate about laïcité, hopefully we'll all be at the same table to debate that, people will always feel belonging to various subnational identity groups. And I think that in a good and free society, we need to make space for that. And I personally think that France needs to make a little bit more space for it. But the task of the most important institutions in society has to be to emphasize that there's something beyond that. But if we end up in a society in which the primary and perhaps the exclusive identity is as white or black or Latino, as Jew or Muslim or Christian, and we don't at the same time sustain the identities that connect us to each other, we're going to go into very deep trouble at the moments of social tension, because it's precisely when people feel threatened or when emotions are running high that we need those uniting identities in order to be able to talk to each other and keep the peace. And my deep concern about the ideology and the practices that have now become mainstream in the United States and increasingly becoming mainstream in other places is that it's doing the opposite. But rather than saying the role of us as an institution is to make sure that we get people to also emphasize those uniting identities, they say from day one, what you do if you're good is to completely define yourself by your particular identities. And then we don't have that shared repertoire left to mediate in moments of conflict. And the second thing I'll say is that it is universal principles, not necessarily in the French sense, that can get us out of the zero-sum logic of many of these debates. Yours, I shared 99% of what you said, but then at the end you called for a fight against Islamophobia, but you did not mention a fight against anti-Semitism, right? But the problem with that framing, where it's always through which community and so on, is that it's inherently competitive. And that is the logic into which so many American institutions have fallen, right? I don't give a shit what my university president thinks about the world. As it happens, I like and respect him a lot, but I really, beyond the fact that it's a coincidence, that he's kind of a friend, like I don't care, right? I don't need an email from my university president to tell me how they feel about the Middle East. But if they've commented on everything else in the world, right? If they wrote about every little tragedy in the United States and gave me their opinion on 17 court rulings they happen to dislike, then I think, how on earth can they stay silent about the worst slaughter of Jewish civilians since World War II, right? Same for free speech. In the last years, there have been story after story of people getting fired, including from universities, for politically controversial speech. On the back side of the ID card at New York University, you have a telephone number to call if you feel that somebody has perpetrated a microaggression against you. It is one of the 4 numbers on the back of the NYU ID card, right? And then you have representatives of student groups celebrating what Hamas has done. When I say, well, hang on a second, right? If one person gets thrown out for whatever perceived microaggression, but now you don't do anything, well, how is that fair? Throw them out as well, right? And the solution to that is to get out of the competitive game. And that means for universities accepting things like the Calvin Report, which is that universities never make institutional statements about things going on in the world, actually maintaining a genuine law and culture of free speech and academic freedom, so that I don't feel like if that person didn't get thrown, if that person got thrown out for this, why is this person not getting thrown out for that? It is actually recommitting ourselves to these universal principles, which aren't abstracting away from real conflicts. They are what stops those conflicts from turning into zero-sum competitions of competitive consolation or competitive expression of sympathy within our institutions.